when I could no longer drive, I asked my daughter if I could move closer to her. Her husband said, "We're not running a nursing home." Figured out. Then she added, "We're way too busy to deal with this." I simply nodded and called a real estate agent. What I did next caused a storm. Margaret sat by the window of her small but well-kept home in a quiet neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio. The late afternoon sun spilled golden light across the living room floor, touching the edges of the framed family photos on the mantel. Most of them were from years ago: Rachel's wedding, the birth of her first granddaughter, and a few Christmas mornings with everyone squeezed together, smiling for the camera. But as Margaret looked at those moments frozen in time, a dull ache settled in her chest, one she had grown too familiar with. For the past few months, things had been changing. At 72 years old, Margaret had prided herself on being independent. She had driven herself to doctor's appointments, to the grocery store, and to weekly bingo nights at the community center. But that independence had started slipping away. It began with missing a stop sign here and there, then struggling to read street signs, and most recently, an alarming near miss while backing out of the driveway. Her ophthalmologist had been kind but firm just 2 weeks earlier. After a series of tests, he had gently rested his hand on hers and said, "Margaret, I'm afraid you shouldn't be driving anymore. It's just not safe for you or for others." That sentence had rung in her ears ever since. Margaret had nodded in the doctor's office, hiding the wave of panic that surged inside her. But on the drive home, what she knew would be her last time behind the wheel, tears had rolled silently down her cheeks. The car felt like a cage, not the symbol of freedom it had been for decades. That evening, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of weak coffee going cold in her hands, Margaret had known what she needed to do. There was really only one person she could call: her daughter, Rachel. Rachel lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, nearly 500 miles away. It wasn't a drive Margaret could imagine making anymore, even if she still had her license. Rachel had built a life there with her husband, Todd, and their 2 daughters. Margaret didn't expect to move in with them. That had never been the plan. But she hoped she could find a small apartment nearby, close enough for occasional help with groceries, doctor visits, and just company. Margaret rehearsed what she'd say for hours before finally picking up the phone late that Saturday afternoon. "Hello," Rachel answered, her voice rushed and distracted. In the background, Margaret could hear children yelling and what sounded like a television blaring. "Hi, honey, it's me," Margaret began, trying to sound cheerful. "Do you have a minute?" There was a pause. Then Rachel said, "Sure, Mom. Just make it quick, okay? We've got a lot going on." Margaret hesitated, but pushed forward. "I went to the doctor again, and well, he says I shouldn't be driving anymore. It's not safe." Rachel sighed audibly. "Oh, that's tough." "I've been thinking," Margaret continued cautiously, "maybe it's time I moved closer to you all. I could look for a small place nearby, just to be near family, in case I need help now and then." There was a silence that stretched too long. Then Margaret heard Todd's voice, loud and unmistakably sarcastic in the background. "What? Does she think we're running a nursing home now?" Margaret's heart clenched. Rachel didn't scold him. Instead, she added quickly, her tone clipped and defensive, "Mom, honestly, we're already stretched so thin, between the kids, work, and everything else. I just don't think we have the bandwidth to deal with something like this right now." Margaret swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I wouldn't be living with you, Rachel, just nearby." "I know, but it's still complicated," Rachel replied, her voice softening slightly, but only just. "There's school runs, soccer practice, Todd's schedule. I don't know how we'd manage even that." Margaret closed her eyes. The rejection stung deeper than she'd expected. Taking a slow breath, she steadied her voice. I understand. Thank you for listening. Okay, well, let's talk later, all right? Love you, Mom. Rachel said hurriedly before hanging up. The line went dead, leaving Margaret sitting alone at her kitchen table, staring at the silent phone in her hand. For a few minutes, she didn't move. The only sound was a faint tick of the clock on the wall and the hum of the refrigerator. She stood slowly, walking to the living room, where she sank into her favorite armchair by the window. The evening sun was dipping low now, casting long shadows across the floor. Margaret sat there for a while, staring out at the street she had driven on for so many years, watching neighbors return home from work, watching kids ride their bikes, and realizing that her life here, this chapter, was coming to an end. Her pride ached just as much as her heart. She had never wanted to be a burden. Even as she aged, she had cooked her own meals, paid her own bills, and made her own doctor's appointments. But now, her daughter's words echoed in her mind, mingled with Todd's biting sarcasm. We're not running a nursing home. Figured out. Margaret blinked away the tears threatening to spill over. After a few minutes of sitting motionless, she reached for her landline phone again. Her fingers hovered over the button for a second, but this time there was no hesitation in her mind. She dialed a familiar number from memory. Good evening. This is Kevin with Turner Realty. How can I help you today? Margaret cleared her throat, steadying her voice. Hi, Kevin. This is Margaret Holloway. I think I'd like to discuss putting my house on the market. Kevin sounded surprised but professional. Of course, Mrs. Holloway. Would you like me to stop by sometime this week to discuss options? Yes, she said softly but firmly. The sooner, the better. After hanging up, Margaret sat back in her chair and stared out the window again, this time with a faint but determined glimmer in her eyes. She wasn't sure what her next steps would be, or exactly where she would end up, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't wait around for anyone else to make decisions for her. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt something close to control returning to her life. As the sun finally disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving the sky tinged with soft shades of lavender and gray, Margaret sat in silence. Tomorrow, her house would begin its journey toward being sold, and she would begin a new chapter. And though she didn't know it yet, this decision, this quiet, resolute act, was about to set into motion a series of events that none of them could have predicted. Margaret closed her eyes, took a long breath, and whispered to herself, I'll figure out in my own way. Margaret sat across from Kevin, the real estate agent, at her dining room table. A thick folder of paperwork lay between them, untouched mugs of coffee cooling beside it. The morning light poured through the window, illuminating the dust that hung in the air like tiny specks of floating time. Kevin flipped through the documents with practiced ease, his pen ready, but Margaret's mind was elsewhere. She had barely slept the night before. After making the call to Kevin, reality had started to settle in. Selling her house meant saying goodbye to over 30 years of memories. The walls still held faint echoes of laughter from family gatherings, and the worn spot on the living room carpet marked where her late husband, Harold, had always rested his feet after work. Letting go of this house felt like closing a book she wasn't quite ready to finish, but she knew she had to. Kevin cleared his throat gently, pulling her back to the present. Mrs. Holloway, I know this isn't easy, he said, offering a sympathetic smile. But the market is in your favor right now. I really believe we can get a good offer quickly. Margaret nodded, trying to summon her resolve. Let's list it, she said quietly. Kevin handed her the pen, and with a trembling hand, she signed her name. Over the next 2 weeks, her life became a blur of moving boxes, packing tape, and strangers wandering to her home during open houses. Margaret kept herself busy, methodically wrapping dishes in newspaper and folding linens into plastic bins. She avoided lingering too long in any one room, afraid of what the memories might do to her resolve if she let them. On a Thursday morning, just before noon, Kevin called with an offer that exceeded her expectations. Within hours, she accepted, and the reality of her decision hit harder than she anticipated. The closing date was set for 3 weeks later. With the house officially sold, Margaret turned her attention to finding a new place to live. Her initial plan was simple: find a small apartment near Rachel's neighborhood in Charlotte, something affordable but safe. She spent hours browsing listings online, her laptop balanced on the same dining room table where she had signed the sale papers. One afternoon, while scrolling through a local Charlotte real estate website, a new property listing caught her eye. It wasn't an ordinary apartment. It was a newly developed senior living community called Maplewood Estates. The photos showed bright, airy apartments with large windows, landscape gardens, and a long list of amenities: a community shuttle bus, organized social activities, an on-site medical staff, and even a small library and game room. Curious, Margaret clicked through the pictures. Residents were shown smiling on walking paths, attending book clubs, participating in group exercise classes. Something about the place felt hopeful. She wasn't ready to call herself a senior citizen. Not really, but she couldn't deny the appeal of the built-in support system. She hesitated for a few moments, staring at the Schedule a Tour button on the website. Then, with a decisive breath, she clicked it. The following week, Margaret boarded a flight to Charlotte for the tour. It was her first time traveling alone in years, and though her nerves prickled as the plane lifted off, she felt an undercurrent of determination pushing her forward. The cab from the airport pulled up in front of Maplewood Estates just after noon. Margaret stepped out, taking in the well-maintained gardens and cheerful exterior of the main building. A friendly woman named Linda greeted her in the lobby, offering a warm handshake and a genuine smile. "Welcome to Maplewood, Mrs. Holloway. Let me show you around," Linda said, leading her through bright hallways painted in soft pastel colors. Margaret toured a one-bedroom unit on the second floor. The apartment was modest but lovely, with big windows letting in streams of light. The living room overlooked the garden courtyard, where a group of residents sat laughing over what appeared to be a game of cards. The bedroom had ample space for her furniture, and the kitchen, though small, was modern and functional. "What do you think?" Linda asked as they stood in the living room. Margaret hesitated, emotions swirling. "It's more than I expected," she said truthfully. Linda smiled. "It's a big decision, I know, but we have a few units available now. No pressure, of course." Margaret nodded, making polite conversation as they completed the tour. But deep inside, she already knew this was where she wanted to be. Back at her hotel that evening, Margaret stared at the ceiling for a long time, weighing her options. Should she call Rachel? Should she tell her about the visit, the decision she was leaning toward? But as she recalled the coldness in her daughter's voice during their last conversation, she pushed the thought aside. This time, she would make her choice without waiting for permission or approval. 2 days later, Margaret returned to Maplewood Estates and met with the leasing manager. After an hour of reviewing documents and payment options, she placed a deposit on the unit she had toured. The move-in date was scheduled for the first Saturday of the following month, just 3 weeks away. Margaret left the office with the keys in her purse and a stack of paperwork under her arm. As she stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, a surprising sensation washed over her: relief. She had done it. She had made a plan for herself, independent of anyone else's opinions or judgments. Back in Ohio, she resumed packing with renewed energy. This time, her actions felt purposeful. She donated boxes of old clothes and household items to charity, keeping only what she truly needed or cherished. Family photo albums, Harold's favorite armchair, her collection of books, all carefully boxed for the journey ahead. Friends and neighbors stopped by to say goodbye, offering tearful hugs and well wishes. Margaret accepted each one with grace, grateful for their kindness but eager to start fresh. On her final evening in the house, she stood at the front door, taking one last look at the rooms that had shaped so much of her life. Then she turned off the lights, locked the door, and slid the key into an envelope for the new owners. The moving truck arrived early the next morning. As the crew loaded her belongings, Margaret sat in the passenger seat of her friend Carol's car, her suitcase at her feet. Carol had insisted on driving her to the airport, unwilling to let her friend make the trip alone. In the airport terminal, Carol hugged her tightly. "You're braver than you think, Margaret," she whispered. "I'm not sure about that," Margaret replied with a small smile. "But I'm doing what I have to do." The flight to Charlotte felt different this time. There was no anxiety, no second-guessing. As the plane descended, she looked out the window and caught sight of the sprawling city below, the tree-lined streets stretching out toward the horizon. Margaret arrived at Maplewood Estates later that afternoon. The staff helped carry her boxes inside. She spent the evening arranging furniture and unpacking, just enough to make the space feel like home. That night, for the first time in weeks, she slept soundly, and she didn't call Rachel. Not yet. Margaret decided she would settle in, get her bearings, and figure things out on her own first. Little did she know, her quiet arrival in Charlotte would soon lead to an encounter she wasn't expecting. The following days unfolded in a way Margaret hadn't anticipated. Maplewood Estates quickly became more than just an address. It became a sanctuary of sorts. The staff and residents welcomed her with open arms, and the gentle hum of daily activity around the community softened the ache of her recent goodbyes. Her mornings began with slow walks through the courtyard garden, where azaleas bloomed in vibrant pinks and reds. She found herself attending morning coffee socials in the lounge area, sitting beside other residents whose laughter filled the air with unexpected warmth. Margaret had never considered herself particularly social, but the easy camaraderie among her new neighbors made it impossible not to feel at home. By the end of her first week, Margaret had learned names and small details about the people she now shared her life with. There was Eileen, who hosted a weekly knitting circle, Charles, a retired history professor who led spirited book discussions, and Doris, whose sense of humor and sharp tongue made Margaret laugh more than she had in months. Margaret adapted quickly to using the community shuttle for errands. On Wednesday mornings, the van took a group of residents to the local grocery store, a modest but well-stocked place called Miller's Market, just a 10-minute ride from Maplewood. It was on one of these routine trips, barely 2 weeks after her move, that life took a sudden and unexpected turn. That particular morning started like any other. Margaret had prepared a short shopping list: milk, bread, some fresh fruit, and tea bags. As the shuttle pulled into the parking lot, she gathered her reusable shopping bags and followed the small crowd of fellow residents toward the entrance. Inside the store, she moved slowly but deliberately through the aisles, enjoying the familiarity of choosing her own groceries again. She was examining a display of apples when she heard a voice she recognized. It was faint at first, coming from somewhere near the dairy section. "Girls, come on. We don't have all day," the voice called, impatient and rushed. Margaret froze, her hand hovering over a Granny Smith apple. She turned slowly, craning her neck toward the source of the voice. There, standing by the refrigerated section, was Rachel. Her daughter was juggling a basket full of items while trying to corral her 2 daughters, Lily and Sophie, who were darting between shelves in playful disobedience. Rachel's hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore the stressed expression Margaret had seen so often during their phone calls. Without thinking, Margaret pushed her cart forward, curiosity overriding hesitation. As she neared the end of the produce section, Rachel's gaze suddenly lifted. Their eyes locked. For a brief, Almost cinematic moment, neither of them moved. The noise of the store faded. Margaret saw the widening of her daughter's eyes, the stunned disbelief as realization sank in. "Mom!" Rachel's voice broke the silence, loud enough to catch the attention of nearby shoppers. Margaret offered a gentle, almost amused smile. "Hello, Rachel." Rachel blinked, shaking her head as though trying to clear her vision. What are you doing here? Are you visiting? Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" Before Margaret could answer, Lily spotted her and squealed with delight. "Grandma, what are you doing here?" The little girl ran over, throwing her arms around Margaret's waist. Sophie followed closely, her eyes lighting up. "Are you staying with us?" Margaret bent down and hugged them both, savoring the innocent affection. Then she stood, adjusting her sweater, and looked back at Rachel. "I'm not just visiting," she said softly. "I've moved here." The words seemed to hang in the air like heavy fog. Rachel's face shifted through a series of emotions, shock, confusion, and then something that looked suspiciously like irritation. "Moved here? As into Charlotte? When? How? Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret kept her tone even, resisting the urge to get defensive. "A couple of weeks ago, I found a nice place not far from here. It all happened pretty quickly." Rachel's mouth opened, then closed again. She glanced around, lowering her voice when she spoke next. "Mom, why wouldn't you at least give me a heads up? I could have, I don't know, help you settle in or something." Margaret gave a small, knowing smile. "I didn't want to impose. You made it clear how busy things are for you. I figured I'd manage on my own." Rachel flushed, caught between guilt and irritation. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." "Do I?" Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. Before Rachel could respond, Lily tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Can Grandma come over for dinner tonight? Please." Rachel hesitated, looking from her daughter's hopeful face back to Margaret. We'll see, honey," she said quickly. Then to Margaret, she added, "We're really swamped this week. Todd's working late. The girls have soccer practice. It's just a lot right now." Margaret nodded, her expression unreadable. "Of course. I understand." There was an awkward pause before Rachel said, "Maybe we can set something up soon? I'll call you." "That would be nice," Margaret replied, her smile unwavering. Rachel gathered her daughters in her half-filled basket, offering a brief, distracted wave before hurrying toward the checkout lanes. Margaret stood there for a moment, watching them go, before turning back to her cart. That afternoon, back at Maplewood, Margaret recounted the story to Doris and Eileen over tea in the communal lounge. They listened intently, their faces a mixture of amusement and sympathy. "So you ran into her at the grocery store, and she acted like you'd appeared out of thin air," Doris said, shaking her head. "Kids these days." Eileen patted Margaret's hand. "You did the right thing. You're allowed to live where you want, and you're certainly not obligated to tell anyone." Margaret smiled, grateful for their support. Still, beneath the surface, she couldn't shake the lingering weight of that encounter. She wondered how Rachel was processing it now, if she was venting to Todd, if the girls were asking questions over dinner. That evening, Margaret received a short, awkward text from Rachel. It read, "Sorry for being short earlier. Let's talk soon." Margaret stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone aside, without replying. Days passed without further contact. Margaret continued to settle into her new routine, attending a watercolor class on Thursday afternoons and joining Charles's book group on Saturdays. Life at Maplewood became full, sometimes even joyful. One bright Saturday morning, Margaret decided to explore more of the neighborhood on her own. She used the community shuttle to visit a nearby park, where she spent hours walking along the shaded trails and sitting on a bench overlooking the small lake. For the first time in months, she felt content, not just because of her surroundings, but because she had taken control of her own life. On her way back to Maplewood, the shuttle made a stop at Miller's Market again. Margaret stepped off, intending to pick up some fresh flowers for her apartment. As she walked toward the entrance, she heard another voice, this time unmistakably Todd's, talking on the phone near the parking lot. He stood by his car, pacing back and forth, sounding irritated. "No, I don't know why she's here. Rachel's been stressed out about it all week. We got enough going on without having to play host to her mother now." Margaret stopped mid-step, standing behind a parked SUV where she remained unseen. Her heart sank, but she didn't linger. With quiet dignity, she turned and walked back toward the shuttle without buying the flowers. As she sat down, staring out the window, a small part of her wondered how long Rachel and Todd could continue pretending she wasn't here. But she wasn't going anywhere. The days following Margaret's unexpected encounter with Todd in the parking lot settled into a strange, almost brittle rhythm. There were no phone calls from Rachel, no surprise visits, no dinner invitations. Margaret wasn't exactly surprised by the silence, but it still weighed heavier than she liked to admit. She kept busy at Maplewood Estates, joining new activities with determination that bordered on defiance. Monday mornings were now reserved for yoga classes designed for seniors. Margaret wasn't particularly flexible, but she enjoyed the meditative breathing and the gentle encouragement from the instructor. On Wednesdays, she attended a community gardening group where residents tended to flower beds along the perimeter of the property. She even signed up for a monthly poetry night, though she had no plans of reading anything aloud. By the second week of her new life, Margaret's calendar was fuller than it had been in years. Yet, despite the distractions, Rachel remained a constant shadow in her thoughts. It wasn't until one late Saturday afternoon that the next chapter in their strained relationship began to unfold. Margaret had just finished organizing a modest book exchange in the community library when her phone rang. Seeing Rachel's name flash on the screen brought a complex mixture of relief and dread. "Hello?" she answered, keeping her tone neutral. "Hi, Mom," Rachel said, sounding unusually formal. "I was wondering, would you like to come over for dinner tomorrow night? The girls have been asking about you." Margaret's heart jumped a little at the invitation, but she kept her response measured. "That sounds nice. What time should I come? Maybe around 5 o'clock? Rachel offered. "Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and salad." "I'll be there," Margaret said simply. Sunday arrived with a nervous energy Margaret hadn't felt in years. She took extra care getting dressed, choosing a soft blue blouse and a pair of slacks she hadn't worn since before the pandemic. She even dabbed on a bit of perfume, smiling at herself in the mirror as she did so. The shuttle dropped her off at Rachel's suburban neighborhood just before 5 o'clock. Margaret walked the familiar path up to their front door, pausing for a second to collect herself before knocking. Rachel answered, wearing an apron over her jeans and t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. "Hi, Mom," she said, stepping aside to let her in. The living room looked exactly as Margaret remembered, cozy but cluttered, with toys scattered across the floor and school papers piled on the coffee table. The girls came rushing in moments later, both wrapping their arms around their grandmother in enthusiastic hugs. "Grandma, come see my new drawing," Sophie shouted, pulling Margaret toward the kitchen. "And I made you a friendship bracelet," Lily added, already tying a string of colorful beads around Margaret's wrist. Margaret smiled genuinely, her heart softening with each gesture. "Thank you, sweethearts. These are beautiful." Dinner was loud and chaotic, with the girls arguing over who got the bigger piece of garlic bread and Todd barely looking up from his phone. Rachel moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, serving plates and refilling drinks. Throughout the meal, She kept the conversation light, avoiding any mention of Margaret's new living situation. At one point, Todd finally spoke, his tone casual but edged with something sharper. "So, how's life over at the retirement resort?" he asked, not bothering to hide the smirk in his voice. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "It's lovely, actually. Full of interesting people and things to do. More active than some neighborhoods I could mention." Rachel shot her husband a warning glance, but Todd only shrugged and returned to scrolling through his phone. After dinner, the girls dragged Margaret into the living room to play a board game, while Rachel cleared the table. Margaret focused on her granddaughters, laughing when Sophie made up her own rules and pretending not to notice the hushed argument happening between Rachel and Todd in the kitchen. When the game ended and the girls wandered off to watch television, Rachel returned, sitting down on the edge of the couch beside her mother. "I'm sorry about Todd," she said quietly, picking at the hem of her shirt. "He's been stressed with work. And, well, the whole situation with you being here just caught us off guard." Margaret nodded, choosing her words carefully. "I didn't come here to disrupt your life, Rachel. I just needed a change. I'm not asking for anything. I'm taking care of myself." Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know. I feel like I'm constantly failing at everything. The kids, work, the house, and now this." Margaret placed a gentle hand on her daughter's arm. "You're not failing. You're overwhelmed. But that doesn't mean you get to shut me out." Rachel swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "I'll do better," she said, though her voice wavered. Margaret squeezed her hand but didn't press further. It wasn't the time for deeper conversations. Over the following weeks, Rachel made small but noticeable efforts. She called once or twice, usually about the girls. Margaret was invited over for Sunday dinners, though the atmosphere remained tense whenever Todd was around. Still, the girls' enthusiasm for their grandmother's presence never waned. They began stopping by Maplewood Estates with Rachel on occasional Saturday afternoons, playing in the community garden and laughing with the other residents. Margaret, for her part, flourished more with each passing day. She organized a small book club that met on Thursday evenings. She volunteered to help with the community newsletter, contributing a monthly column about local events and resident highlights. Her name became familiar in every corner of Maplewood. Despite Todd's coldness and Rachel's emotional distance, Margaret found herself genuinely happy for the first time in years. But tensions at family gatherings continued to simmer just below the surface. Todd often made sarcastic remarks when he thought no one was listening. Comments like, "Guess we'll have to schedule Grandma time now," or "Next thing you know, she'll be moving in with us." Margaret ignored him as best she could, though each jab left its mark. One afternoon, during a rare private visit from Rachel, they sat together on a bench at the park near Maplewood. The air was warm, and the sounds of children playing drifted around them. Rachel stared out across the grass. "You know," she began hesitantly, "when you told me you were moving here, I felt trapped, like I was suddenly responsible for another person when I can barely manage my own family." Margaret listened, saying nothing. Rachel continued, "But seeing you like this, making friends, being independent, it's actually good for both of us, I think." Margaret turned to her daughter with a gentle smile. "I'm not here to make your life harder, Rachel. I just want to live mine, and maybe when time allows, be part of yours." Rachel nodded, biting her lip. "I'll try to make more time. For the girls, and for you." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. As they sat together, watching Lily and Sophie chase each other near the swings, Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction. The distance between her and Rachel wasn't gone, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like they were both reaching across it. Margaret didn't know what the future held, but she knew she could handle it. The air felt heavy that morning, as if the universe was holding its breath. Margaret had woken with a faint headache and a dull ache in her lower back. Dismissing it as a typical sign of age, she took 2 aspirin and went about her usual routine. She watered the small fern in her window, fed her cat, a rescue she had adopted just weeks after moving in, and opened the curtains to let the soft Carolina sun flood her living room. After breakfast, she decided to attend her watercolor class downstairs. She had been working on a small painting of the Maplewood Garden, a project that gave her both comfort and distraction. Halfway through the session, though, the ache in her back sharpened. It became more than discomfort. It turned into something that made her pause mid-brushstroke, her hand trembling slightly. "Margaret, are you all right?" Doris asked from across the table, concern clouding her face. "I'm fine," Margaret lied with a tight smile. "Just need a little rest." She excused herself, slowly making her way back to her apartment. Each step felt heavier than the last. By the time she reached her front door, her vision blurred at the edges. She barely made it to the couch before her legs gave way. Sitting there, catching her breath, she told herself it was probably just fatigue. Maybe the gardening the day before had taken more out of her than she thought. But as she stood to fetch a glass of water, the room tilted violently. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the carpet, her head hitting the corner of the coffee table on the way down. The impact sent a sharp, searing pain through her temple. Darkness crept at the edges of her consciousness, but before she passed out completely, she had the presence of mind to reach for the emergency call button provided by the Maplewood staff. Within minutes, a nurse and 2 staff members were at her side. The ambulance was called without hesitation. Margaret faded in and out of awareness as paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher. The last thing she remembered before everything went black was the shrill siren as they pulled away from the complex. Meanwhile, miles away, Rachel was sitting at her office desk, buried under a stack of reports, when her phone rang. Seeing an unknown number with a local area code, she almost let it go to voicemail. Something, perhaps instinct or guilt, made her answer. "Hello, this is Rachel." A calm but serious voice responded. "Mrs. Williams? This is Nurse Patel from Mecklenburg General Hospital. I'm calling about your mother, Margaret Holloway." Rachel's heart dropped instantly. "What happened?" "She had a fall in her apartment. She's stable now but has a head injury, and we're monitoring for signs of concussion. There's also concern about internal bleeding due to her medications. We'd recommend you come in as soon as you're able." Rachel barely heard the rest of the details. Her hands shook as she scribbled down the room number. Within moments, she grabbed her purse and keys, yelling to her assistant that she was leaving for the day. During the drive to the hospital, her mind raced. The image of her mother lying helpless, perhaps unconscious, filled her with dread. Guilt flooded her chest, making it difficult to breathe. How long had it been since she last checked in? A week? More? Arriving at the hospital, Rachel rushed through the sliding doors, taking the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator. She found the room quickly, her heart pounding as she pushed open the door. Margaret lay in a hospital bed, pale and with a small bandage above her eyebrow. And 4-line dripped fluid into her arm, and a heart monitor beeped steadily beside her. Rachel froze at the doorway, tears already stinging her eyes. "Mom!" she whispered, stepping closer. Margaret stirred at the sound of her daughter's voice. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for a brief second, confusion clouded her gaze. Then recognition settled in. "Rachel," she said, her voice dry and hoarse. "You came." Rachel pulled a chair close and grabbed her mother's hand, holding it tightly between both of hers. "Of course I came. I'm so sorry, Mom. I should have been calling more, visiting more. I didn't know. I didn't think." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand weakly. "I didn't want to bother you," she murmured. Rachel bit her lip, shaking her head as tears slid down her cheeks. "You're not a bother. I was wrong, so wrong." The doctor entered shortly after, giving Rachel an update on Margaret's condition. The head injury appeared minor, but there were signs of dehydration, and more concerning was a discovery of early-stage pneumonia, likely unrelated to the fall, but caught during the initial scans. Rachel stayed by her mother's side for hours, refusing to leave even when Todd called repeatedly asking when she would be home. Late in the evening, as Margaret drifted in and out of sleep, Rachel stepped into the hallway to return Todd's call. "Hey," she answered when he picked up. "I'm still here. She's worse than I thought." There was a pause. "Rachel, I get that you're upset, but we can't let this take over everything. You got the girls to think about. Work. You can't be at the hospital 24 hours a day." Rachel's frustration boiled over. "You know what, Todd? For once, I don't care about the schedule or the soccer practice or how this affects you. This is my mother. I should have been there for her before, and I'm not making that mistake again." Todd fell silent on the other end. "I'll be home when I'm home," Rachel added before hanging up. Returning to the room, Rachel found Margaret awake, her eyes following her daughter's every move. "You don't have to stay all night," Margaret said softly. "Yes, I do," Rachel replied, pulling the chair closer. The night passed slowly. Nurses came in and out, checking vitals, adjusting medications. Rachel dozed in the chair, but woke every time Margaret stirred. By morning, there was slight improvement. Margaret's color returned, and she managed a few spoonfuls of broth. The doctor mentioned keeping her for at least 2 more nights for observation. That afternoon, Lily and Sophie arrived with handmade get-well cards, their faces lighting up when they saw their grandmother sitting up, even if she looked tired and frail. For the first time in days, the room filled with something other than fear, laughter. The girls climbed onto the hospital bed carefully, showing Margaret their drawings and chatting away about school and friends. Rachel sat nearby, watching her daughters with a mix of pride and guilt. When the girls left with Todd later that evening, Margaret turned to Rachel. "I never wanted you to feel obligated, Rachel," she said softly. "But thank you for being here." Rachel's throat tightened. "You're not an obligation, Mom. I'm sorry if I ever made you feel that way." They sat quietly for a long time, the weight of old wounds lingering, but somehow lighter now. That night, Rachel drove home with a new determination forming in her mind. She would make time. She would be present, not just when emergencies happen, but on normal days too. Margaret had come all this way to be near her family. It was time Rachel finally met her halfway.